add a teensy bit more, I'm going to try to keep this as brief as possible, to Andrew's question / subheading, what is composition? So he's really talking about the idea of composition, but also how the term composition exists across all of these different fields and all of these different disciplines, because, you know, and underlying a lot of this, I think he's making a lot of assumptions about what we know about composition as a field, which is a little bit problematic because we might not know anything, which is completely expected, right? Like, it's not until you hit graduate school, it's not really something that we study. It's becoming a newer thing that we study. So speaking of that, okay, I started at Millersville in 2016, and at the time, faculty who had started prior to me started a writing studies undergraduate pathway. So at Millersville, you can get a Bachelor of Arts in English, which is literature, or you can get a Bachelor of Arts in Writing Studies, which studies some of these ideas of the craft of writing. Not first year, like first year composition is not a part of that major. First year composition is a standalone, but not standalone because it's typically a general education requirement. Okay, so now we've got multiple layers of what we're talking about with composition. So to start off with, Millersville terms our version of composition as a major writing studies, probably responding to, and again, this was created by faculty prior to me, so I don't know the history and why they went with that concept, because the field of composition studies uses both composition and writing studies, sometimes interchangeably. Some areas use writing studies more frequently, other areas composition more frequently, and you just kind of, as somebody navigating those spaces, you figure out which one is right, and then you use the right one in the right space. So Millersville for the major uses writing studies. In our general education, we have a first year, one semester, and then we have a third year, we call it advanced writing. We use composition to talk about both of those, and in the general education requirements, the term composition, not writing studies, but the term composition is used with the learning outcomes and with stuff like that. And the credits for both of those classes are a part of the general education. They are not a part of the major. That is typical across 99% of institutions of higher education in the United States. Canada has picked up a model similar to ours. As much as Canada is based on the British system because they are a part of the United Kingdom, parts of their education system more closely mirror the United States than they do the United Kingdom. And the existence of a composition course, and again, even newer than us. So the United States, so if you go back even historically, the United States shifted to including a composition course in the late 1800s. Basically, Harvard opened up their admissions to more than just a handful of elite people. Harvard admissions / citizenship in the United States was undergoing a huge change in approximately the 1850s, so about 100 years after the founding of the United States. And because they were still reading into the Founding Fathers' connection between public education and an informed citizenry, or an educated citizenry, and the benefit to voting when your electorate is educated, they started pushing public education, and so Harvard is a response to that. And then this is also when we started to see land grant institutions formed, like Millersville, because we were also formed in the 1850s. So partly in competition with those land grant institutions that were forming, and partly because the faculty decided in the 1850s that students today can't write. Yes, we have been saying, we the faculty, we the generation older than the generation before, you know, that comes after us, that kids today can't write since the 1800s. Woo! And we will continue to say it for probably another 150 years. So here we go, right? So composition as a field, or as a class that is being taught, started in the 1850s, and it really started with literature. And people in literature were like, well, if students read across genres of great works, they'll have exposure to, and this is where our brain works, right? Like, they're not wrong, but our brains will have exposure to sentence structure and vocabulary and argument structure. And so reading great literature will produce better writers. Yes, but we also know, especially when we're going for land grant institutions and we're dealing with brain science, that unpacking the hidden curriculum there, or pointing out the practices, and this is going back to or connecting to the rhetorical handbooks, pointing to and naming the practices so that the students going through those practices can name while also practicing improves retention, improves application, improves learning, improves future transfer to other situations. So we become better writers when it's not just exposure to, but it's exposure to with very structured curriculum, like a handbook that names these practices that we're going through, right? So like the bigger history of composition, opening up institutions, opening up admissions in the 1800s, and as a response to kids today can't write, we start to see a shift to literature faculty and the English departments taking on this burden of teaching writing. And then fast forward another 100 years, we get to about the 1960s, 1970s, and people in literature start questioning, like, hey, we're learning this stuff over here in psychology, like specifically neuropsychology and then neurobiology about how brains operate. Why aren't we using some of that to help inform how we're teaching first year writing? And so that connection then kicks off a divide in English departments, like, and for a while, especially like the 1970s, 80s, 90s, a very contentious divide. I mean, I've heard that divide is still contentious at some institutions. The Chronicle of Higher Education chronicled one, and it was a California school, and I can't remember what it is. You could find it if you look through Chronicle of Higher Ed, but some English departments are still contentious because of that divide. Some get along a lot better, but you see an actual divide, and then you see the creation of PhD programs in rhetoric and composition somewhere around the 1980s, 1990s. So I'm, like me, I'm only the second generation of people who got PhDs in this field, but composition then is, really new. So it started with, we're opening up access to institutions, and we have this idea that students can't write. Not everyone got the same background education. And so literature takes on the task, and we see a lot of practice and culture and language use. And so eventually over time, and when we see brain science come in, so there's some really, really great studies, and we read these in an actual like straight composition class. Flower and Hayes are really known for how they broke down writing, how they do research on writing, very heavily informed by like action research and scholarship of teaching and learning methodologies. So we see methodological changes in the 80s, which then kickstart a whole new field of PhDs and honestly a whole new field of study. That is where Andrews is basically starting when he's naming composition. And what he's getting at is, okay, this history. So then the thing that we want to return to, because composition courses are general education courses, they're seen as requirements that I'm forced to take, hoops that I'm forced to jump through, things that I have to do because I'm told I have to do this. And that mindset impacts how students understand them. And to a huge extent, it becomes a service course. It's not connected to a major, which then means people assume, oh, well, if it's a service course that's not connected to a major, it must be outside your field of research. And so it's not even meaningful for you to teach. And that's where composition is really connecting. And you can see this in Andrews, although he's not saying it explicitly. We're returning to rhetoric and the idea that rhetoric has always been theory and practice. And because it's always been theory informing citizenship and government and how we understand communicative acts, and then praxis, how we produce communicative acts, and the idea that to help others produce these meaningful communicative acts, we have to focus on teaching and pedagogy matters. We're pulling all of that into composition and saying teaching has always mattered. But so is the theory of all of this, and so has practicing all of this. And then what we're seeing is a contemporary rereading of that situation. So when Andrew says, what is composition? He's kind of assuming we have some of that baseline. So I just wanted to backfill it a little bit to help you and then kind of contextualize it with Millersville. So we do have an undergrad major in writing studies that studies some of this, but not even necessarily this whole history, but then connected to that, especially when we get to the grad level, year level, we see, this, and you're seeing it in this class already, right? Some of you are teachers and some of you aren't, but it is impossible to talk about rhetorical theory without also talking about pedagogy and the practices and the art of teaching, because it's always been connected to the idea of rhetoric. And so then when we pull it over to composition, some of you may or may not teach others to write. When we talk about the act of writing, and then also to separate it from creative writing, which we'll talk about in another section, we have to pull in those same ideas. Like, what is the public nature of composition, of writing? How does it operate in the real world, connected to citizenship and connected to government and connected to social life? And then, because we want people to do well there in both the production of and the meaning making of, then we need to talk about some of the theories related to that, but also the practices. How do we teach people to do both of those things? Which means that we're both focused on what does it look like for them to go through it and how do we teach it? And all of that is interconnected in rhetoric and composition, and why they're kind of stuck together, and then why this class is named what it is. Okay, so it's kind of a lot. So if you have questions about that, let me know.